Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Wollongong's Innovation Campus. In Wollongong, we have two campuses, this one just up the road. We have 9 in Australia, and we take our Meet the Researchers series around to all of our campuses. My name is Professor Sarah Williams. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for University Impact at the University of Wollongong. Before we carry on, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, both here in person and for those people online, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. Right, so this Meet the Researchers series is designed to bring the research of the institution into the public sphere, to grow the connectivity that we have with the public, with the communities in which we find ourselves, to enable people in those communities, governments in those communities, businesses, the public, to hear about some of the work that we're doing, the benefits that that work is bringing to society and the environment, and to actually just have a chat with our researchers after the event. So without any further ado, I'm just going to reach across to my phone, which I should have had with me, in order to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Jeff Kelleway, and he's Senior Research Fellow in the Environmental Futures Research Centre at the University of Wollongong. He specialises in the response of coastal wetlands to environmental change and their potential role in climate change mitigation. The research brings together elements of ecology, geomorphology, and biogeochemistry, with Dr. Kelleway and his group working in diverse settings across Australia's coastlines. Dr. Kelleway is also a member of the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Life Sciences at the university. So Jeff will be presenting on climate change and coastal impacts. Welcome.
Thanks, Bradley. Evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone online. So I am an environmental scientist and specifically a wetland scientist. So anywhere that's wet and muddy and full of mosquitoes, you'll probably find me there. Here I am in my happy place out in the field, a setting that Sarah's going to talk about up in the Great Barrier Reef, but essentially measuring vegetation, taking soil cores and trying to understand the influence of the tides and the chemistry of the ocean on wetland ecosystems. They're the things that interest me, and I'm going to talk about a few of those things today. So, as an overview, I guess I'll be talking, giving a brief introduction to coastal wetlands, why we should be caring about them and why we should be researching them, and why we want to know what climate change is doing to them. And I'll present 2 case studies, one being the impacts of sea level rise on coastal wetlands, and the second being black summer bushfire impacts. Then I'm going to flip the coin and talk a bit about a good news story, which is that coastal wetlands can actually play a part in our fight to manage the impacts of climate change. So here's a nice coastal wetland in Tower Point, so Botany Bay, not too far north of here. This is where my students and I do a lot of our research. And what you've got in this photo is a representation of wetlands from low elevation, so our mangroves at low in the tidal zone, going up through the salt marshes, which you see there's no trees there, that's grasses and rushes and succulent plants, salt tolerant. And then at higher elevations, you've got supertidal forests, so paperbark swamps, casuarina swamp oaks. I can see out the window here, Pucker's Estate, a really good example of supertidal forest. But across these three intertidal and supertidal wetland types, we get a lot of value as humans from these places. When the tide comes in, like it is in this photo, you've got a lot of our coastal fish resources coming in and feeding in these wetlands. They're referred to as the pantries of the estuaries and the coastal zone. There's a whole lot of food sources there for those fish that come in, and this really sustains a lot of our coastal fisheries. They're also really important for biodiversity, whether it's migratory shorebirds that fly halfway around the world just to find a nice patch of wetland, through to all other sorts of everything from swamp wallabies in our part of the world through to Bengal tigers that live in the mangrove swamps of Southeast Asia. And of course, if you're working in Northern Australia, crocodiles is one thing that we have to be cautious of. So, yeah, these coastal wetlands do a whole bunch of things for us. They also filter out water quality. So polluted runoff goes through these wetlands, and then a lot of the pollutants will be taken up through that wetland, and the waters that go out into our coastal waterways where we swim, where we get our food, they're cleaner waters because of these wetlands being there. So lots of benefits from these coastal wetlands. So we probably want to understand what's going to happen to them as our planet changes with warming, with rising sea levels, and other impacts of climate change. So the first thing here is that mangroves and salt marshes occur in the intertidal zone. So the tide's coming up and down every day, and over time, as sea level rises, even if gradually, that has influence on what types of vegetation occur where. So here we have a photo of a mangrove out in the salt marsh, moving out into a salt marsh wetland. So as sea level rises, we actually see more and more of this occurring. Now the thing about mangroves in particular, they've got these gnarly root systems, which do two things. One, they help to build elevation. So as the roots grow, the wetland grows. And that's really important because sea level rising, what are the wetlands going to do? They need to rise as well. So the root growth is really important. The second thing that these gnarly root systems do is they slow down water movement and trap sediments. So sediments move through in the water hits those roots, energy slows down, and sand, silt, muds get dropped down to the wetland surface. Again, helping that wetland to grow. So mangroves really good at moving their elevation and growing in height, their surface elevation as sea levels rise. Unfortunately, the salt marshes, which are these grasses and succulents, they're not quite as good at it. So the consequence is that over recent decades where we know and we've got measurements of sea level rising, what we've been seeing happening is mangroves moving in to salt marshes. Great news for mangroves, not so good for salt marshes or any animals that require salt marshes. So the research that my team does around this is trying to understand what does that mean? Who are the winners and who are the losers? Here's one more example from the Georgia River up near Picnic Point in Sydney. And on the left side of the screen, you see aerial imagery from the 1940s, where there aren't many trees in that wetland area. It's a salt marsh without trees, and then as you follow that time series through, you see that the mangroves are actually moving in and colonising that former salt marsh, to the point where it looks much more like a mangrove forest with not much salt marsh around it these days. So what are the implications for this? As I mentioned, good news for mangroves. If you're a mangrove tree or you rely on mangroves, that expansion of habitat as sea level rise is a good thing. It also has good news if you're looking at shoreline protection. Mangrove swamps are really good at protecting us against storm surge, against cyclones, and some of those impacts. However, if you're one of those migratory shorebirds that's flown halfway across the planet to get a nice open line of sight, free from predators, you don't want to get ambushed, so you need to be able to see for tens and hundreds of meters. Well, trees moving in, mangroves moving into that habitat isn't great news. That becomes suboptimal habitat, not great habitat. The other thing is that, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, these mangrove forests store lots of carbon in them. Like any forest, there's lots of carbon buried in the trees, and below ground, mangroves, it turns out, do a little bit of a better job at storing carbon than the salt marshes do. So our research helps to identify what are the values you're trying to protect in a wetland. In some national parks in New South Wales, they're now removing mangroves to support and maintain salt marsh habitat for migratory bird species. Is that, that might be a good idea in some places, but elsewhere that might not be a sustainable option. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of climate change is bushfire impact. As a wetland scientist, this is something that wasn't in my toolkit until Black Summer came along, and our colleagues in marine parks on the south coast said, we've got evidence of mangrove forests burning down to the ground essentially. What does this mean? What do we do? And so Black Summer fires were concentrated in the coastal zone, and they were also followed up by some pretty severe flooding, the La Nina years we had on the back of those fire impacts. So our research with some of our honours students at the end of their environmental science degree, we get them out into the field helping out with this work, and we've studied across 3 estuaries in southern New South Wales, the Clyde River at Batemans Bay and Largan Creek near there as well, and then right on the south coast, Wollongong Lake. And what we've found across those 3 sites is that those first observations were, in the worst places, were a pretty devastating impact. So mangrove forests that looked to be completely dead from impact, some of them, trees exploding from fire impact, some of them just, the fire front got too hot and the mangroves died as a result of heat stress. It looked like pretty bad news to begin with. And in some places that remains to be the case, there hasn't been a whole lot of recovery. But monitoring this through time shows that there are some signs of life. Eucalypt forests that got hit by the same fires, within 3 months they've got the new sprouting leaves and they're growing back. We're talking more 1, 2, 3 years before we're starting to see that same sort of regrowth on some trees. So mangroves aren't quite evolved to recover from fire, but they do have some capacity. And we're also seeing the seedlings are starting to come in and repopulate some of those areas, but not all. Salt marshes, on the other hand, this photo at the top left corner, they bounce back straight away, like a grass fire. A few months later, everything's grown back and nice and happy again. So these are things that we just didn't know about before Black Summer, and our monitoring's helping to understand those recovery trajectories. So the things that we're now looking at in terms of those fire impacts, here's a drone image that we took from the site down in Batemans Bay. You can see that dead forest. That's the mangroves. This is an area that didn't really have much resprouting trees. Those green triangles at the bottom of the photo, they're the only places where those trees have actually bounced back themselves. What we're looking at now with those little red dots is the seedlings that get washed in on the tide. Where are they occurring? And we can see that there are still areas throughout that mangrove forest, especially the low elevations near the seaward edge on the river, don't have any plants growing, whether it's the old ones, they haven't recovered, and there's no new ones coming in at those lower elevations. Now remember I said mangroves need to be building elevation through growing their roots, through trapping sediments. If you kill that tree, it's not growing roots anymore, and perhaps might not be growing its elevation. Those roots that were there were probably dying and decomposing, and the wetland elevation is probably sinking. And so that's what we're undertaking now, measurements in the field in the worst impacted sites, and comparing them with our measurements that we do by hand in the field with special survey techniques, comparing the impacted versus healthy reference sites to understand what does the future hold for these impacted sites. And do our colleagues in marine parks, do they need to support replanting options, or what are the possibilities there? So that's the bad news, the climate change impacts. As I said, I'm going to flip the story here and talk about a solution that these wetlands hold. So if we're going to address climate change, first and foremost, we need to be reducing and reversing our emissions. So our reliance on fossil fuels need to go, but we also need to be looking at ways that the nature can help bring more carbon out of the atmosphere. We've affected the balance and put too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. How do we get more of it out? Well, we know trees are great at doing this. Turns out coastal wetlands are particularly good at doing this. So here we've got our mangrove forests, like all trees, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And those roots that I mentioned, there's a whole lot of carbon in those, and they're going below ground into some saturated anoxic, so no oxygen, very little oxygen in these waters, really good conditions for preserving, like peat. And so the organic layers build up, and as material washes in through the estuaries, that builds up carbon-rich substrates building up over time. So we measure the trees out in the field, and through drone imagery and various other techniques. But the magic is really below ground in those mucky muds. We call it blue carbon. It's a nice marketing term, but it's muddy, brown, organic matter. But we also need to know about what's happening in terms of emissions and the flux of greenhouse gases from these wetlands. And so we use more advanced techniques and instruments to do that work as well. So our research working on blue carbon and the carbon cycle in these wetlands, combined with colleagues all around the country, has helped lead to a change in policy, not only in our states, so a lot of our coastal states now are looking for options to restore coastal wetlands, because they can see they're a climate change tool, but also our federal government, our Commonwealth government, has a new method. So where you can gain carbon credits as a landholder by restoring these wetlands. And this is sort of a world first to have this in a domestic climate change policy. And so our research has been able to be really important. And the concept behind this is a lot of our coastal waterways have these sorts of structures, floodgates, or other infrastructure that stops the tides from moving in and out like it naturally did once upon a time. So those floodgates are built to protect property and create agricultural land, which is no longer fit for purpose. If we move some of those structures, then we do three things. One, we knock out some of the bad emissions that those freshwater degraded areas might be creating. And two, we allow new habitat for the mangrove trees to come in. Those trees have lots of carbon. And we create an opportunity for more and more of that soil carbon to build up over time. So our research at the moment is really trying to understand what are the opportunities of these wetlands for fighting climate change, and in particular, bringing that first element I said, wetlands need to rise with sea level rise. What is sea level rise going to do to their capacity to pull more and more carbon out of the atmosphere? And so we work with partners in the New South Wales government and colleagues around the country to do this work in the field with lab experiments and everything from humble tea bags in the second photo there as part of our experiments through to some pretty high-tech instruments as well. So in conclusion, there's two sides to the coin with coastal wetlands. First, they are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We've seen over decades what sea level rise has done in terms of mangroves moving in the landscape. And more recently with Black Summer fires, what the impacts out there. But secondly, if we restore these wetlands, then that's going to bring a whole lot of benefit to us and to other parts of nature. And it also has that benefit in terms of fighting climate change. So just finalise by acknowledging and thanking a whole bunch of students in particular who help out with this work, both as undergrads and in honours and PhD programs, and a bunch of colleagues as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. You're not off the hook yet. There is an opportunity for you to ask questions from the floor here in the room, and then also people online. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat, and Sarah will read them out to us. And I'll lead off with a question. So on the one image where you were showing the recovery of one of the wetlands, and you had the small green, the few green recovery trees, and then you had the red dots where the new seedlings were coming in. It looks like the seedlings are really finding their feet quite close to existing trees and existing forests. Can you maybe comment on that observation?
Yeah, so those little red dots where the seedlings are washing up, and it's actually, yes, some of them are near where trees are the most dense, but it's actually around where the strand line is of the tide. So it's only at those highest elevations. These little mangrove propagules float on the water. You'll see them on the beaches around the place, but they'll float on the tide. And so, like driftwood, they'll land in a certain place. And unfortunately, that's almost always at those higher elevations. In a healthy forest, you'd have lots of them dropping off the parent trees at lower elevations, and a lot of them will stick in the ground, but because those parent trees are dead, we don't actually have that opportunity. We're relying on the tide to move things, and they're really getting concentrated at that drift line.
Yeah, okay. Question, yes.
Oh, Jeff, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to look at the mangroves up in Bundina. I noticed, I haven't been there for a number of years, and they were very high, now they've quite died off. Could you explain or give a theory to what's going on there?
Yeah, so the question for those online who couldn't hear, Bundina in the Royal National Park, there's a large area of mangroves in Port Hacking, and there's actually dieback. So we had a student group work up there to investigate this. And what has occurred there, in Bundina, it's very shallow in those areas with the sand movements moving around, and so it's a tidal creek there. And what's happened, the sand movement has actually blocked off that creek and created a berm. And so as a result, you have flooding behind it. The tide can't drain out. And so the water has actually, those mangroves actually flooded because it's essentially like having a wall that stopped the tide from going out. And yeah, those mangroves are just, they're good at dealing with being wet, but they can't be wet for too long. They need the tide to go out. But in this instance, the tide couldn't go out until a big rain event came months later and opened that channel again. And so, yeah, there's a dieback event there, but it is starting to regenerate, thankfully.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
This is maybe not in your area, but it's a sea level rise question. So the last time we had a big sea level rise was, I understand, about 11,000 years ago. Do we know how quickly the sea came up then compared to what it is doing now? Because presumably what we've got now managed to adapt and to be what it is.
Yeah.
Quickly. Is it? But I'm imagining it's happening a lot quicker this time.
Yeah, right. So sea level rise has changed over centuries and eons, and it is that period that we've actually looked at. So colleague Professor Hamylton at Macquarie University led research where we looked at the global record of soil cores to see what were mangroves doing 11,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, when sea level rise was at rates higher than it is at the moment, and at rates where we might be heading towards in the coming decades. And unfortunately, the prognosis isn't great. I've said mangroves have been doing really well under current sea level rise rates. As soon as we get to about 7 millimetres a year, we're about 3 to 3.5 at the moment. When we start getting to 5, 6, 7 millimetres a year, that's where we start to see mangroves not being able to withstand that sea level rise. So it really comes down to what we do in terms of emission reductions in the coming years and decades as to what's going to happen on our coastlines.
So just tapping into that question then, is there some way that in which we can sort of artificially slow that down by having these barriers, such as some of that you mentioned, whereby you, in a sense of forced evolution, you're selecting those that can migrate quickest over a period of time.
Yeah, so I guess we probably need to start getting creative about how we're going to deal with climate change and natural solutions. In some instances, that might include engineering works. In some places with coastal wetlands, in some parts of the world, they're actually applying sediment. So there might be a dredging operation going on offshore. They need to get rid of that sediment, and we've got wetlands that we know are drowning because they can't keep up. Thin layer depositions of sediment is being trialled in some places, hasn't been done in Australia yet. Our sea level rise rates aren't as high as they are in other places of the world where there's a lot of subsidence, but it might be, those sorts of things might be things that we want to start thinking about.
Yeah. Sarah, are there any questions online? No. Nothing coming on. So I know this, and I don't know which however it is. When it comes to reforestation, it's really important to reforest where there were once forests within the current sort of era. It's not just a question of planting trees wherever you want to plant trees. They need to be where they should be. In the context of wetlands and mangroves and adaptation and the ability of these wetlands to be a carbon sink, maybe just reflect on how one can think about translating that concept of reforestation to creating wetlands and mangroves.
Yeah, so people love to plant trees. That's a good thing. Governments love to support planting trees. That's a great thing. Mangroves mostly do the work themselves. You can see those red dots. The tide's brought new future trees into that landscape, and it's selecting by itself where they want to be. There's been a long history of trials of planting mangrove forests, largely through Southeast Asia, where there's been massive deforestation in the past. A lot of them have got it wrong just because it's not in the right location, as you say, or conditions have changed. And that might be the instance with the fires here. So it's really about what we're doing in the fires work is looking to see what nature is doing first. Then if there's gaps to fill with strategic plantings, trialing that and seeing what nature will allow us to do.
Yeah. Any other questions from the floor or online?
Just one more, so who is managing our wetlands and mangroves? Who's looking at these events and saying, oh, we need to let water out? You know.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Who are the gardeners?
I guess, yeah, we all are. It's all part of our estate and our backyard. Some of these are privately owned. A lot will be in Crown land, and so it often falls between the gaps between terrestrial land resources who are owned and monitored by certain agencies, and then the marine estate, which might be managed by others. So I guess that's probably part of the reason for a long history of neglect of these sort of intermediate environments. We do have things like there's a New South Wales marine estate strategy now. I guess we've learned from those past mistakes. There are now at least agencies involved in doing that sort of work, but monitoring systems, using satellites for real-time monitoring, that's the sort of place we'd probably be going towards.
Okay, thanks very much. And it really gives me great pleasure now to introduce Associate Professor Sarah Hamylton, who's associated, also like Jeff, with the School of Earth, Atmospheric and Life Sciences. She works alongside colleagues like Jeff, and is also presenting this evening on management issues such as marine pollution, deforestation of mangroves, the establishment of marine protected areas, where she collects and uses information, particularly in the form of digital maps, as you will hear in a short while, to aid management decision-making in coastal environments. Sarah's research focuses on developing models to better explain and predict characteristics of tropical coastal environments, which takes a broad international focus, including projects in Fiji, Seychelles, the Red Sea, and of course in Australia. Sarah.
I'm Sarah. I've worked at the University of Wollongong for 13 years now. I only ever planned to stick around for a couple of years, but slowly over those years we've built a research group of about 20 staff and students with colleagues, Colin Woodruff, Kerry Rogers, Jeff, and a whole bunch of other people along the way, many of whom you just saw in those pictures. So we run a coastal science group over on the main campus. We've got about 3 boats. We've got a big cupboard full of drones. What else have we got? We've got a room full of computers. If the University of Wollongong managing a marketing department, to be believed, we spend our time kind of skipping about on boats and floating next to big important coral reef pinnacles and things. But yeah, the other side of the work that we do is this thing called spatial analysis, which is much more kind of spreadsheets and statistics, and we've got this big room of computers, which is quite high-end processing machines for working with big data sets. Often there are students in those rooms of computers sort of scratching their heads going, oh, why isn't it working? So that is also, believe it or not, something that I'm quite passionate about. Not confusing students, but spatial statistics. At the heart of what we do, we work in a range of different coastal environments, some coral reefs, some mangroves, as you've seen. We are kind of a group of geographers, so we're interested in understanding places, and in particular how those places are changing over time. Let's go forward. There we go. Has anybody been to, or does anybody know what I'm talking about when I talk about Martin Island? No? Been down to Port Kembla? Yep, so if you go down to Port Kembla, I did this recently actually. One of our sons, our 8-year-old son, wanted to go and see Transformers, so we went down to, what is it? What's the cinema down there? Wollongong, that's what I'm talking about, thank you. Which you might,
Sorry, Sarah, just give me a second, I'm just checking something here.
you stick Transformers in your mind for it.
Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna have to log out, sorry, I thought I could follow from here. It's not working. Apologies, everybody.
Okay, where was I? Transformers, and we got down there a bit early. Not really my idea of a good time, but my idea of a good time was going to the top of Hill 60, where you can look out and you can see the 5 islands, right? So pretty much if you go to any hills around here and look out to see, you see the 5 islands. There's sort of 3 of them along in a line that go out from the foot of Hill 60, and then there's 2 that are sort of stretched a bit north. So Martin Island is the oceanward side of those 3 that go along the south. And there's a big and a growing population of Australian fur seals on Martin Island. So one of the first projects I wanted to talk about as a local one was work that I did with a guy called Lewis Esteban, who was an honours student of mine, and we went out 12 times, 12 months of the year, and we took the university boat out from, do you know Port Kembla boat ramp, where the long sort of strip of rocks, the breakwater is? We'd go out from there and we'd motor out to Martin Island, about 15-minute motor, and we'd sort of take the boat around the island and look at how many seals we thought we could see up on the rock platform. And then we'd put the drone up in the air, and it would fly on a bunch of predetermined flight lines above the island. And when we got back to the uni, Lewis would use some of that special software and stitch all of the pictures together, and then it became kind of like a Where's Wally exercise. He'd sort of look at these seals, which happened to always be the same colour as the rocks that they were lying on, and he'd pick them out, and we'd get back from our boat trip and we'd be like, oh, about 6 seals today, and he'd go, actually, more like 76 seals. So there was often a lot more that you could see from the drone than what you could see on the boat. If you look in detail, you can see that we're all smiling in this picture, because these trips made me very nervous, because the other thing we had to do was you'd have the drone in there, and it's pre-programmed on these flight lines, so it's pre-programmed to land exactly where it took off from. but of course there's waves and there's current. So you're kind of going backwards and forwards in the boat, trying to catch this drone as it's coming down. And on a couple of the days, in fact, I was talking to Bradley about this yesterday, we put an infrared camera on the drone, which probably adds about 10 grand's worth of gear to that drone. So you're quite nervous trying to catch it. And the other thing, of course, as the person in charge on the boat, I've got these students and they're sort of leaning out over the edge and there's a wave coming to pitch and I'm thinking, this could end in a disaster, but it never did. And the University of Wollongong is always very safe in its operations. So, where are we up to? So this seal population, interestingly, there's 4 seal populations that come around the Victoria and New South Wales coastline. The one that you see, the ones that you see up and down here are Australian fur seals. They are originally from the Skerries, which are much further south, just south of the Victoria border. And so they come up here and mostly you see them hauling out and enjoying a bit of sun. So initially, hold on, I think there's another diagram here. Here we are. What you're looking at there is 12 pictures. That's 12 mosaics that there's from the drone images. Each of those individual images, about 200 photos stitched together. Where you see red dots are where we saw seals. So Lewis started his project in February, and you can see we'd go out from the breakwater, motor around to the island. N equals 6. We saw 6 seals in February. We saw 7 seals in March. I was twiddling my thumbs by April, going, this is going to be a bit of a poor project. There's not many seals for him. But then the numbers did build throughout the year. So we got what was peak seal month? October. You need to get out there now. 150 seals. So there was kind of a big seasonality to the occupation at Martin Island. And if you look at that plot there, we've got the black bars. That's the number of seals that we saw on a monthly basis, January through to December. And you can see there's this inverse relationship with that red line, which is the sea surface temperature. So it seems as though the seals really like it up in Martin Island when the temperatures are a bit lower. Okay, so they spend a lot of time in the water. Anybody seen a seal in the water recently? Quite often they're kind of on their side with their flippers up. Those flippers are kind of like radiators. So their blood is just circulating through there and they're regulating their body temperature. Interestingly, we've been in touch recently with the Department of Energy, Climate Change and the Environment. They're really wanting to find out the extent to which seal populations are expanding. They seem to be going further north along the New South Wales coastline and the numbers are really exploding. And largely this is because we are now 10 years on from, I've forgotten the name of the legislation, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act, which essentially stopped people. Seals don't have a very good reputation around here because if you're fishing from a boat and you catch a fish, quite often you don't get to the fish that's on the end of your line before there's a seal there catching it. And before this act was put in place, fishermen would often just get out a rifle and shoot the seal and then pull their fish in. Okay, so seal population numbers went right down in the 70s and the 80s, but slowly they've been coming back. And actually we're seeing a real explosion in their populations now. So they're moving further north. Not only are they moving further north, but they're starting to not only haul out here, but breed up here. Okay, so what was 4 populations will probably become more and more populations up the New South Wales coastline. All right, so on to more exotic environment up on the Great Barrier Reef. This is a project I did with Jeff back in, gosh, when we were up there, 2021, June 2021 we went up. I like to call this one an intergenerational research project because essentially I was handed a whole bunch of maps of the Northern Great Barrier Reef from a guy called David Stoddart, who I like to call my academic grandfather insofar as, I'm not sure how much you guys know about academics, but when you do a PhD and you become a doctor, you get supervised by somebody who becomes your mentor for about 3 years. So he was my supervisor's supervisor, and he's been a real inspiration to me in my career, because he's quite a renowned coastal geographer. Wherever I've worked in different countries, some quite isolated locations, he's often kind of helpfully come through and made maps and published about these places. Really interesting guy. Anyway, he gave me these 53 maps of islands on the Northern Great Barrier Reef and said, do something with Sarah. Like, I don't know, I don't care what you do, but just do something with them. And then he died 2 years later, and I was sort of like, oh, what am I going to do with these maps? So this is kind of part of that project. We visited 10 islands, the Hoek Islands, and we were looking at comparing the extent of the mangrove forests, hence Jeff came along as our mangrove expert, and we were mapping them with drones a couple of years ago, and we were comparing those maps to he had visited in 1974. And actually he chose to visit those islands because they were islands where sort of a very legendary expedition occurred on the Northern Great Barrier Reef in 1928. And it's often called the birth of kind of modern coral reef science. And they had also visited and mapped these islands. But not only had they mapped these specific islands, but over the last 100 years, because of some of the processes Jeff was talking about, sea level rise, there's been really dramatic change to the landscapes on these islands. So an intergenerational research project, maps from my academic grandfather, and then Jeff took a PhD student along, Zach, and they did a lot of kind of climbing among the mangrove roots and a lot of field work in terms of measuring trunks and branches and things. And then I also took a PhD student along, Oksana. We got the easy job, we got to just kind of fly the drone from the beaches. And this was a project that also focused on carbon. So that was quite, if you remember back to Jeff's slide where he had that blue carbon role of mangroves and how they, as they grow, they take carbon from the atmosphere and they lock it into their trees. So here we were looking at above ground biomass. So rather than the peaty, organic, quite phenomenal mud that you see underneath mangrove forests, we were looking at the trunks and the leaves. And essentially we found, what did we find? So since the 1970s, when the solar had been there, there's been an expansion of about 667,000, that's supposed to say meters squared across those 10 low-wooded islands, which equates to about 10,000 tons of carbon. I did write down what that means in terms that might make sense to people. That's about 10,000 football pitches worth of mangrove trees since the 1970s. So massive areas. What's that complicated diagram on the right-hand side? So essentially just walking through some of the nerdy science. We've got the drone survey of the island. We then make a canopy height model. So you've got a really detailed 3D map of the forest itself. We try and validate that. So some of those trees that Jeff and Zach would have climbed around and measured the heights of, we compare their tree heights that they measured in the field with our drone measurements. We then make a look at the relationship, and we did this for both old forests and new forests, the relationship between the tree height and AGB, which is the above ground biomass, how much carbon is stored in those trees. And then this is the nifty bit, because we mapped the forest in detail on a massive scale with our drones, and we know the tree height for every single pixel in our map, we can calculate the above ground biomass from that equation. Okay? Everyone following? There will be an exam afterwards. Okay. Where are we up to? What are we doing next? So, last year I did a study with our PhD students, and we worked out that in terms of Australian waters, there are about 1,000 low-lying islands. We call them reef islands, which are essentially piles of sand. In Australian waters, they're very isolated, very seldom visited. Even the most passionate sailor wouldn't have set foot on many of the shores of these islands. We can see they're up the Great Barrier Reef. What have we got here? Have we got a laser?
It won't work on that screen. It won't work on that screen.
That's all right. We've got the coral sea there, Torres Strait, the northwest shelf there. That black dot out in the Indian Ocean, that's Cocos Keeling. And then we've got this series of islands off of Western Australia as well. Each of these islands have got their own story to tell in terms of they've got a human history associated with them, they've got a local environmental setting in which they sit, and the way that we expect them to change over the next 100 years, 1,000 years, is going to be quite unique to that local environment as well. So one of our up-and-coming projects is really looking at visiting the islands from these different regions and teasing out that question of how they're going to change and what that means for some of Australia's remotest communities. So what you're looking at there, what are you looking at there? That is Rat Island, which is right in the middle of the Hoop and Wallace Island. So those are fishing, that's a fishing village, okay? And it's probably occupied seasonally for Western rock lobster fishers. And in terms of sea level rise, these are some of Australia's oldest reef islands, and they're actually Pleistocene reef islands, which means that most of the reef islands you see today have formed over the last 10,000 years. These ones are about 130,000 years ago, so they're from a different period of sea level, a different geological period. And if you were to walk these, you'd find that there's a nice beach here, but this is all kind of overhanging, really gnarly, sharp coral reef, and it's probably raised about 1.5 meters above sea level. So actually, these guys don't have too much to worry about. Why does our research matter? Bradley was asking me to answer this question as well. So this conversation is a national conversation in terms of vulnerability of reef islands. We've got islands flooding in the Pacific and across the Indo-Pacific. In Australia, we've got our first climate refugees. They are in the very northern Torres Strait. A couple of islands up there, Boigu and Saibai, which are right kind of skirting the border with Papua New Guinea. They have now been evacuated. People have left them as floods have come into their kind of rice plains. And some people might be aware, it's been in the papers a fair bit, that 2 Indigenous elders from those islands took the Australian government to court to sue them for negligence because they weren't acting enough to abate the impacts of climate change. It was quite foreseeable that with sea level rise, that some of these islands would become flooded. What are we looking at here? So this is another island, Warwick, which is again in central Torres Strait, low-lying island. We can see on the left-hand side, I'll keep doing my laser, anything that's blue there is projected to be flooded. So that is a engineer's report that was used as evidence in court for that court case. And it looks like, so Warwick's got a population of about 200 people living on it, and it looks like it's got a very wet future ahead of it. This is the kind of size that I think underpins a lot of the kind of the national debate, and essentially it's quite a, what do we call them, culture wars. It becomes quite a polarized debate because people are sort of talking, okay, this is an existential crisis, these islands are going underwater, but actually these islands might be low-lying, but they're not just inert piles of sand that water builds up around. We know as coastal geomorphologists or geographers, geomorphology basically means understanding how landscapes change over time, but they actually adapt. Just talking about, you know, mangrove forests growing and moving up the coastline as the sea levels rise. And it's the same for reef islands, they move around a lot. You can actually look at them, they're almost like sand calendars in the sense that you can look at them at one part of the year in the summer and all of the sand goes on the east side, and then in the winter it's all over on the west side. So what we're looking at on the right hand side is the same island, Warriba Island. We've got the shorelines moving. So here we've got the shoreline as mapped. Somebody's literally drawn around the shoreline. If it's blue, it was a while back, it was in the 1980s. If it's yellow, it's reasonably recent. So here, old shoreline built out. So Warriba, for instance, you know, a classic example of a reef island is in the sense it's very isolated, doesn't get visited very often. It hits the headlines because there's a cemetery up here, and we've got graves washing into the sea. But actually, if you come around to the other side of the island, and what's that? That's like a half-kilometre walk. We've got the island accreting, the opposite occurring. So actually, there's a real geographic nuance to this debate. You know, we can start to learn from the natural behaviour of islands and say, yes, it is an existential crisis that we've got these low islands and that they're experiencing flooding. But actually, if we look at how those islands behave naturally, why don't we, rather than building around here, build here and see what happens and see how long we've got. So that's the sort of, I suppose, insights that our work can do for quite remote coastal communities. Wrap it up. So how do we address coastal questions and challenges as university researchers? So within our group, I suppose, I'd say there's a few things that we do. One is that we leverage the benefits of emerging technology. So drones, not just drones, but you strap new and exciting sensors onto drones. If you want to map seals, why not try mapping their body heat? If you want to map a mangrove forest, well, we've got this new sensor that allows us to map in 3D. So drawing on the latest technology, People often think of the arts as being a creative pursuit, and I think that the sciences is equally a very creative pursuit, and it often doesn't get thought about in that way. So something that I think our group does quite a good job of is, we know the technology well, but actually to bring that technology to bear, going into that room full of computers, processing the data. If you're a bit of a nerd and you know about things like spatial sciences and spatial statistics, you can start to see these patterns across nature and go, oh, I know how we could express that in our equations. I know how I can, you know, send a drone in the air, model those mangroves, and then model how we might expect them to look in the future. And that's, to my mind, is a really creative pursuit. And the other thing that we do, obviously, is that we don't do our research in a vacuum. So you might work with government departments or isolated communities. For example, our work in Torres Strait, we're invited up there because people are worried about their island homes and what they're going to look like 100 years from now. So, you know, where possible, we work with people and address challenges as they come up around Australia. And I think I'll leave it there.
That's it, thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Mike, Jeff, you're also not off the hook yet, so you can grab your water and come straight back. So thank you very much for that really insightful discussion, and it is open for questions and comments. I'll lead off, and with your work with the Australian fur seals, there was that inverse relationship with sea temperature. Does that also correlate with the availability of food? Because of course there is a lot of fish migrating as the sea temperatures change seasonally, and of course seals eat fish predominantly. So your thoughts on that? I don't know if the shoals of fish and the prey of the seals have been mapped seasonally as well.
Yeah. So, to be honest, I don't know the answer. But we can go and work it out. We can send a student out. I would have thought that the type of fish that the seals are going after in terms of their prey are kind of fished all year round in the waters around here. So I imagine those fish don't move around too much. So things like snapper, for instance. But yeah, increasingly we are seeing more fish coming up from the south, but also a lot more tropical fish coming down from the north. So that might be something that we have to look at in a bit more detail in terms of changing species distributions.
Yeah. Question?
I'm curious about predators for the seals. So initially it was humans with their rifles, but now, so with their abundance growing, what about predators coming back in again and help change that level again?
Just repeat for you.
Yeah, so for the people online, the question was, there's some curiosity about the seal predators, and if the seal population comes up, is that going to bring in more predators? Yeah, I think that is a concern. I think I've had conversations like that with colleagues in local council. I suppose we've been working with the seal population at Martin Island since 2019. I've never seen, I guess what I'm really worried about is big sharks and things. I've never seen any evidence of that. I've seen plenty of dead seals around, but they seem to be, you know, the kind of old seals or some other form of misadventure. Probably the fishing industry, I would imagine, poses much more of a risk to the seal population. Yeah, but often, if populations are on the move, and there's a lot of conversation about northern populations coming south as waters get warmer down here, that has massive ecological implications because they don't move in isolation, they're part of the broader ecosystem. Yeah, so who knows, maybe more sharks will come around.
I was just wondering, are the seals can they be tagged, or has anyone done that yet? That's another area again.
It's another area. So there's a big seal population down at Narooma, Barranguba, what's it called, Montague Island, and people are tagging seals down there. We're working with colleagues at the Department of Energy and Climate Change who are part of an active seal tagging program around there. So, and essentially that map that I showed you that looks at the different seal populations where they're going, that would have been made through tapping work, so, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes, Ina from Anchors, just across the road. My question goes to when you showed the islands and how the shorelines are changing, what are the time frames we're looking at? So when you said the moving islands, basically, so what are the time frames when this happened?
So the question is, what are the timeframes for island shorelines changing? So I suppose different environmental settings have different rates of change going on in them. But broadly, so for example, with Warraba, we're looking at probably about 250 metres of change. That there are different modes of island change. So there's a seasonal change that occurs, you know, it shifts to one side of the island and then 6 months later it's on the other side of the island. Similarly on our beaches around here, they're all devoid of sand at the moment, but six months time, the sand will creep back. So that's like a seasonal shift back and forth. And then superimposed on top of that is a longer term change. So what you often see with islands is that they actually migrate. So they kind of just move slowly across because they're basically sitting on top of a reef platform. So you've got a coral reef that's grown up and probably taken about, it's grown up across the Holocene, so it's probably taken about 10,000 years to reach sea level. And then you've got the shallow platform that sits in about 1 metre of water, but that's a tidal metre of water, so it's going up and down. And that creates an environment where coastal landforms then form, and they're very dynamic indeed. So what you often see with islands is that they'll form on one side of a reef, and the reef platform itself might be 2-3 kilometres long, and then they just kind of march across to the middle of the reef or something like that, or expand across the reef. And over much longer time scales, like tens of thousands of years, that entire reef itself can be thought of as a bucket. And if you go for a dive around the outside of a reef, there's really nice corals and stuff growing. That's where all of the carbonate that built the reef in the first place is being, like if that was a carbonate factory, those would be the workers working really hard. And then a big cyclone or storm comes through, smashes all of that up, and takes over and like fills this bucket. So geologists often talk about, they think about reefs in terms of tens of thousands of years. And over those sorts of timescales, that bucket fills in and then it gets full, and then you get really dramatic change happening. So that's when islands start to grow and just fill up entire reefs.
I have another question. Dang. So with the high definition modeling that you're doing, or at least mapping that you're doing, it does give an opportunity for many different types of models and different types of modeling to be done. Just your comment on that, because obviously with the drones and the changing technology and the changing sensors and hyperspectral imaging and all sorts of different modes of imaging and of mapping that you can do, it gives deeper and deeper richness to the type of modeling that we can bring about. Yeah. And of course, stretching the limits of the software and what you can do. So maybe just comment on how that has shifted over the period.
Yeah, people use this term modelling, and it can mean all sorts of different things. Even with respect to scientists working with mathematical models, there are lots of different things that people mean when they talk about modelling. So I suppose broadly, for me in my career in the lab that we've built up, we sort of say if it's coastal and it's spatial, then that sort of will do it. And so people come to us, and it might be looking at the vulnerability of indigenous artifacts up on remote islands, or it might be looking at how seals on our shores nearby are changing. But yeah, there can be all sorts of different kind of statistical approaches. And actually, I think this is where one of the key values of doing kind of the sort of work that our group does is that it comes back to this idea of creativity. Because actually, we're not limited by technology. The technology can do loads, and we're not limited by our computers. We've got a room with very powerful computers. The thing that's probably limiting us is our own knowledge. And probably one of the most exciting aspects of my job is just sitting, every week we have a coastal coffee, and we're in a room talking to each other, and we have really creative conversations about, why don't you take that instrument, and often, you know, it's not just a drone, you've got a bunch of instruments that you're hanging off the side of the boat or something like that, and you say, well, if you combine that with that, and then we can apply some, I don't know, spatial error regression to such and such a data set and come up with this, and that to me is quite an exciting conversation to have.
Yeah.
Not everybody, but.
I'll just check. Okay, no more online, so please join me in thanking our two presenters.